All right. This is a fun one, but you shouldn't use it. So this is just for fun. Has anybody used this zqil parameter before? Some people? No one? Try it once in non-production and then forget about it, but it's fun, okay? The reason you don't use it in production is because all the stuff I'm going to show you, it writes it to the database log file, not to some side log file, right? So it just pollutes the database log file like crazy with a bunch of lines in it, right? But what's fun about the zqil parameter is it not only shows you which index you use, but it shows you how many of the index fields, so how deep into the index you go. So if you have an index on order number and order name and order line, or I don't know, whatever, you know, you've got A and B and C as 3 fields in your index, zqil will show you how many index fields you're using. And every time I talk about indexing and index selection, there's always people in the room who have a very fuzzy understanding about how the compiler is able to use the columns in your index, all right? And probably the most important thing you need to know about the usage of columns in your index is you have to use them in order. So you cannot use the second field in your index unless you use the first field in your index with an equality statement. And you can't use the third field in your index unless you use the first and the second in equality statements. So it's not good enough to say, you know, if I have an index on A and B and C, if you say where A is greater than this and B is greater than that and C is greater than this, guess what? The B and C are completely discarded and you're only using the A for the range match on the index. So really, really important to remember, it's equality, equality, and only the last field that you use is range. And zqil will show you here how deep you're going into that index. I don't know if I'm doing okay on time. So the way they show it is they show you upper and lower bounds. So when I look here, for example, and I just do for each customer no lock where city equals Bellevue. Well, there's no index on city. So what does it show me? It shows me that I used index number 15, which is the primary index. And I'll show you some code later on how you can convert the 15 to an actual index. And it shows me that I have 0 range bounds on the bottom. What does that mean? Greater than or less than in an index. And 0 range bounds on the top. And again, I'll show you in more detail in just a second. The important thing to see here is when you see 0, 0, it means full table scan. It means I used this index and nothing limited the amount of that index that I used. I used the entire index, I read the entire table. Now, if I go and I say where country is greater than A, there happens to be an index on country. And so what I'm saying here is I'm using one field and I'm setting a lower bound for that field, right? I want to know everything that's greater than A on that field. And so what is this telling me? I'm using index 17 on country, and I set one lower bound greater than A, and I set 0 upper bounds. Second example, where country is greater than A and postal code is greater than 100. Well, even though I happen to have the index in question is country and postal code, even though it's both, because this is a range match, I can't use the second field. And so again, I see 1 and 0, a lower bound and an upper bound. But if I use the first field country in an equality match, so country equals Austria and postal code is greater than 100, well, an equality is always an upper bound and a lower bound, right? It's equal. So I set the upper and the lower bound. So it shows me here that I have 2 lower bounds, the country and the postal code, and I have 1 upper bound, which is the country. And also shows me here that I'm using 2 fields deep in my index for my bounds. So again, lots of fun to do. I don't know how useful it is, but I always like to show it because it's fun. Yes?
Just to clarify, it only works for shared memory connections.
Only works for shared memory
And
connections.
it's a client startup parameter.
And it's a client startup parameter. God forbid you would put this on the database itself, right? Again, very, very verbose. I'm only showing you 2 lines, but each one of these is actually like 20 or 30 lines in the log file. So if you were using this across the board, it would just be generating all kinds of junk in your database log file. Yes?
So in this example, maybe picking the middle query, essentially it's saying you've got a superfluous column in that index that's not being leveraged. If you were just running that query against that table, you'd be better served to have 2 indexes, each with a single column, so that they would both be leveraged.
So the question is, would it be better to have 2 indexes so that both indexes would be leveraged in this particular case? The theoretical answer is yes. The practical answer is no, because Progress will only use 2 indexes with equality matches on all the fields. So Progress in this particular case would not use the 2 separate indexes. It would pick one of the 2 indexes and do the same thing. All right?
So in that, sorry, one follow-up.
No, please.
So in that instance, if that's the only query you're running and that's the only index you have on the table, you'd better served to just reduce that index to that first column, because they're just indexing needless information that will never get used otherwise.
Depends how else depends on what other queries you have.
Yeah, that was the only query you're
Right.
running.
Well, this second query here is equivalent to saying for each customer no lock where country is greater than A, colon, if postal code is less than 100, then next, right? That's the equivalent of this query, because we're not, the postal code side of things, since the postal code side of things are not being resolved at the index level, it means that your 4GL code, your AVM, is actually filtering that. But the records are coming based only on country, so you're reading all of the records where the country is greater than A, and then your client is filtering out the ones where the postal code is greater than 100. So it's the equivalent of doing that. And we often see people, again, just remind you over and over again, it might be something you did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we're just reminding you here, this is a way to just double check that you're going as deep, right? I mean, the typical example is you went into Protop RT, you ran your query, it showed that you did 11 million reads, you don't understand why, you think your query is clean, you do this, and it says, well, you only used 1 field in the index, and you're like, now that makes sense. The reason I did 11 million reads is because I only used 1 field in my index, essentially. All right, and what's index 17? I was telling you earlier, you just do find underscore file, find underscore index of underscore file, right, where the index number is that, and that's how you can get the index that belongs to that index number 17, that index number. Good? All right. So combine those two. It's what I said earlier. You combine those two, and it tells you why you read so many records, right? You did not go deep enough into the query, into the index, to pull the records.